Alright everyone, I tried to put the window down over there so the breeze won't blow on it. I realized in the last video there was a little bit of interference because of the wind, although that's dying down a little bit. It's time to talk again about Le Pen, because naturally, with 2 weeks, well not even quite 2 weeks, left to go until the French election there, everyone's trying to do everything that they can to dislodge Le Pen to keep her from perhaps eking out a win there. This time they're claiming that she is a Nazi, or you know, I guess a female French Adolf Hitler or something, for the crime of pointing out that the occupied government of France, basically the puppet regime installed by the Nazis that was collaborating with them, was largely the group responsible for for anything that happened that was wrong at the time in the 1940s in occupied France, and that the average French citizen does not necessarily share that blame. How this makes her a National Socialist, or a racist, or an anti-Semite, I'm not exactly sure, because that has nothing to do with it. What she's pointing out is what people have pointed out here. Like when we talk about in the United States reparations or systemic racism or something, people always overlook that there are people in this country whose families were never involved with slavery, in many cases lived in a state where it never existed. That's probably the most pronounced in my home state. Of course, it was never legal here. We weren't even part of the United States. We were an independent republic and outlawed it in our Constitution before we got absorbed into the United States, before we even petitioned to become a state. So people often overlook this, and in their haste to use race and ethnicity and so forth as political cudgels, they would rather you not think about that fact. For instance, look at segregation. Segregation was never in force in many parts of the United States. Where it was in force, it was the result of state governments that put it in place. It wasn't the result of some democratic action by the average Southerner, any more than slavery was. The number of Southerners who even owned slaves was slight. Most of the slaves that ever existed didn't even come to the United States. They went to Brazil and the Caribbean. But you're not supposed to talk about that. You're not supposed to think about that. Otherwise, somehow it means you're defending racism or defending slavery or something like that. It's an extremely dishonest tactic. It's also dying out over time. People are starting to realize that it's full of shit. In the case of what Le Pen said, what she's saying is that a puppet government that was set up to collaborate with Nazi Germany out of pragmatism for not wanting to have your nation entirely destroyed, that was singularly responsible for the decision-making processes at the time, but it wasn't technically the French government. It didn't really represent a sovereign France. It represented, yeah, the Third Reich is in control. Ultimately, yeah, people who are directly in favor of those policies, they're responsible if they're having such actions. And she's right on that token, and can be condemned for it in the spirit of a sovereign France. But at the same time, there were also partisans running around that directly opposed it. The average citizen was not part of the decision-making process and is blameless in such a struggle. It's just like when we blame, or when we see blame cast at the average German for the Holocaust or for World War II. The average German was not part of that decision-making process. The average German didn't put the Third Reich into power. The alternative that was essentially given to them at the time was communism anyway, so I'm not sure that fewer people would have died had that taken hold. It probably would have been even worse. They would have become a puppet of the USSR, and you would have had some of the famines and pogroms from them. You would have had, it would have been far worse. It would have been an extension of the Holodomor, and the world would be probably a worse place for it if communists had risen to power. When we're looking at France today, the average person in France wasn't alive in the 1940s. Those that were generally very young. Very, very few people were already adults at the time when we're talking about the middle of the 1940s. That's point number one. Point number two, the Vichy government at the time was a puppet regime. It was not put into place to protect French sovereignty. It was put into place by people there in order to collaborate with the Nazis to preserve some semblance of, you know, still existing and not getting bombed out in their own homes. The actual functioning French government wasn't even in France at the time. It was a puppet regime. So what the fuck does that have to do with the average French person living today? We're talking about events that happened in the 1940s. Why are people still so concerned about stuff that happened back then? The only reason they're making this conflation is because Front National happens to believe in vague populism and having borders. It's the only reason. If this had been a statement that was made by Macron or Hollande or something, people would say, well, yeah, of course. He's not excusing war crimes. He's not excusing anti-Semitism. He's pointing out something that's historical fact. Yeah, it was a puppet regime. The average French person wasn't part of the process of making decisions to collaborate with Nazi Germany at the time. So, what the fuck is she saying that's anti-Semitic or like ethnic nationalist? She's not even talking about ethnicity. She's talking about a nation in the sense of a civic structure. She's talking about a sovereign, sentient France that at the time did not fundamentally exist. How is the average French citizen today responsible for such things? Yeah, it's common sense what she's saying. People jumping down her throats or just seeking to denigrate her support just a little bit more to keep her from possibly eking out a win over the leftists. Basically, France right now gets to choose between populism/nationalism light in the spirit of Le Pen, because Fillon, of course, can't do anything, or socialism, essentially a continuation of globalist Hollande-style policies. Not even really left on foreign policy. Hollande was more than happy to start bombing things in Syria and Iraq before. For little actual provocation, he was bombing the wrong people the entire time, but nobody wanted to talk about that either. Just a bloodthirsty globalist like any other that hides behind a red flag and a veil of socialism in order to crow about social justice, while at the same time claiming Le Pen is somehow a Nazi sympathizer for pointing out, oh yeah, I wasn't alive at the time. I didn't have anything to do with occupied France or anything that happened there. Most of the voters weren't. Most of them are presumably not, in their 90s. Most people voting in France. Okay, the population of Europe is getting older. Does that mean that the average person going to the ballot is going to be 100 fucking years old? No, I don't think so. She's completely and utterly right. And her pointing this out, it's historical fact. It doesn't have anything to do with being a secret Nazi or something like that. If you think that Le Pen is a Nazi, if you think that she's some German supremacist or white supremacist, I would say you really need to take a good look at your politics. You need to take a good look at your beliefs and see if you aren't totally fooled by propaganda. That's about all. Peace out.